Welcome to Leonardo Book Club. My name is Danielle Siembieda. I am the Managing Director for Leonardo, the International Society for Art, Sciences, and Technology. The book club is a series where we are introducing the people who write our books, our articles, authors, artists, researchers, scientists, to connect with the audiences that read them. And we're very lucky today to be able to have this particular book club with one of the newer books, Laboratory Lifestyles, The Construction of Scientific Fictions. This book is actually co-edited by Sandra Kaji-O'Grady, a professor of architecture at the School of Architecture at the University of Queensland, and Chris Smith at the University of Sydney, an associate professor of architecture and design. Just to give you a little bit of ground rules around the book club and the event that we're doing today and others similar to it, we are very happy to have you engage, ask a lot of questions, and ask the authors about where the book context is from, anything that you want to actually connect with in terms of what the subject matter is about. These are the experts in that area. We just ask that you be courteous and respectful of other attendees and people who are engaged in the chat as well. We encourage comments and questions. We do offer discounts if you haven't read the book and you want to read the books. Nick will put some links to how do you actually get a discount on the Leonardo Book Club series and other ways that you can engage with the Leonardo community, like our laser talks and our residency programs and our journals, and other ways that you can connect with the transdisciplinary world that we live in. So we do encourage you all to participate in that. So what I'd like to do is start off this conversation by having both Chris and Sandra introduce themselves a little bit more, and then also introduce a little bit about the book for those of you who are not as familiar with it. So I'm going to turn it over to the both of you.
Hi, I'm Chris Smith. I'm an associate professor in architectural theory. Both Sandra and I have architecture backgrounds, me more theory, Sandra more history and critique. We came to this work over a long period. We established a grant with the Australian Research Council that focused on looking at the way in which architecture deals with the ideas and ideals of science and the sort of interaction that occurs between architecture and science. This edited book is part of a much longer, very long project that we've been working on over many years. Sandra?
Yeah. So when we first got the project, we were well progressed on a book that Chris and I were writing together, and the process of writing together was incredibly enjoyable, as was touring around the world looking at our laboratory buildings. One of the great things about our subject matter was that the contemporary laboratory buildings are often in excellent. We had undertaken a trip that took us through Barcelona, Paris, London, and then later I went to the US and toured around. But as we were undertaking our book, which was focused on the architectural expression of laboratory buildings, so we were very interested in the form making, we realized that the rhetoric about laboratory buildings that we were hearing from architects, facility managers, scientists, was very much around the management of social relationships amongst the scientists. So the things that we were initially interested in, which were to do with the appearance of the buildings, were not the things that we were hearing most about. We were hearing a lot about the facilities that would draw the scientists together and have them socialise together, and that we realised that there was a whole other project there.
Yeah, but one of the key things we were looking at, I guess, was the odd concurrency that occurs between a sort of socialization process, like the processes involved in constructing an image for science, and also the sort of management of scientists and the construction of culture for scientists. And strangely enough, the often quite intimate relationship between what institutions and were trying to do culturally and what the architecture itself was doing. There were odd, we used to talk about it in terms of odd rhetoric that flowed, and it was a rhetoric about that was both a verbal sort of oft repeated sort of story as to what it was that scientists were doing within the spaces and how the spaces were working, but also it was the same rhetoric that the architects were sprouting about what it was that they imagined their buildings were going to achieve for science and for scientists. Strangely enough, the repetition of this sort of rhetoric, and it was often rhetoric around socialization. It was rhetoric around the way in which discovery occurs as a group sort of process. When 3 or 4 people from different labs bump into each other in a well-lit atrium on a DNA sort of formed stair. That it was the repeated refrain over and over again. But there was very little. There was little evidence for whether or not that was the case, or whether it was just the easy or the cliched sort of way of speaking about what was going on in these buildings.
I think one of the key moments for me was a scientist advising other scientists who are procuring new buildings, saying that if you come across a situation where your budget's being cut, give up the laboratory spaces before you give up the cafe. The cafe is the most important space. And this is incredibly interesting if you start thinking about what scientific work actually is. So it seemed that scientific work had, in the mind of some architects and scientific managers, had moved out of the bench space and into the cafe. So the cafe had become the critical space for the laboratory, which really begs the question of what scientific work actually is, if it's a kind of vocational leisure, a managed vocational leisure, which is being aimed for in the architecture.
Yeah. And architecture came to, it's only really in the last 50 years, I guess, that architecture starts to become more than just housing the science or scientific production, and becomes actually part of the production. It was always part of the production process, but actually it starts dealing with more and more. It becomes an image for science, I guess. At the moment, it also becomes something like an odd way of cajoling a large population of people. It becomes sort of part of an organization's focal point as well. We saw buildings repeatedly used in advertising material, in financial reports, as a sort of image for what it was that the scientific organization, these bioscience laboratories were actually about. And we think of that in sort of very well in multiple ways, and the book sort of ways, but what becomes sort of, it's almost in the absence of an image for bioscience, often deals with the microscopic, and for which there's scant imagery available. Architecture often then starts to stand in place of some of that, and make some of the suggestions about work value and science value, and the value of science as a career.
We also, as we were having these conversations, realised that the project was too big for a single book, and that we couldn't do the backgrounding that was necessary. So getting, Chris, you mentioned that over the last 50 years, we were very focused on contemporary architecture. That was had been our proposal for the grant, that we would be looking at buildings from the last 10, 20 years. And it really, the story was a longer one than the last 10, 20 years. We really needed to go back as far as the Salk Institute, back as far as Los Alamos, and understand where ideas about conviviality and its management arose and how they were thought about in science over a much longer period. And we felt we also needed to see it from different angles. So when we set about structuring laboratory lifestyles, we went out to people from a really vast range of disciplines, to artists, to architectural historians, to historians of science, to an anthropologist of architecture, just trying to get multiple views on what it was that we were looking at, and a much broader set of case studies than we had for the forthcoming book, Lab Oratory.
So I do want to talk about the forthcoming book, because I think that's really important. But I wanted to make sure that some of the terminology that's in the book that we're discussing is clear to the audience. And one of the something that you discuss quite a bit within the book is the term lifestyle science. So can you elaborate on what this is, and any other terminology that would be helpful for the readers to understand?
Yeah, okay. So some of the readers probably have a better grasp of the history of the term lifestyle than we do. So lifestyle, came up as a term as far back as Thorsten Veblen, and the idea of a kind of conspicuous consumption, and the way leisure and one's choices around leisure indicate class, vocation, a lot to do with class, the idea of the kind of leisure class, and the way that leisure from the end of the sort of mid-19th century onwards becomes something that is a way of displaying how one belongs to a community or to a class group. Yeah. So we were looking at some of the discussion around lifestyle as a term in sociology particularly, and starting to understand how that idea was being incorporated into the way scientific organisations were managed and constructed.
Yeah, it was in part also because what we were actually just seeing on the ground when we're looking at these buildings and the boom in these buildings of the last 20 years is how much of the building and how much of the space and how much of the campus now is dedicated to what we used to think of as lifestyle, or what we used to think of as that which occurred outside of work and outside of work structures. And what we started noticing, of course, was that where in that sort of a disciplinary society sort of model, you go to work from certain hours, you then go home from work, and then you have family time, and then you have recreation time, and you et cetera, and that sort of dividing up of the day and the week and the year, it was collapsing. And with it was also a sort of strange architectural collapse, and the architecture, the buildings, the campuses start to do more and more and more. And largely that slide is actually much more a slide where work seemed to be swallowing everything and taking everything into its recreation, swallowing work as part of it. And so it became a sort of interesting study of the types of social manipulations that are involved, or the type of institutional organization of people and people's lives, and containment and control sort of that. We've seen and looked at many models of where the scientific institution starts, and the lab itself actually starts to formulate things like volleyball teams, and starts to run its own sports programs, starts to deal with its own yoga program, starts to deal with every meal that the scientists are having, and the offering of free coffee constantly to keep them fueled, and that it was largely, I mean, we couldn't help but see this in part as lifestyle science, when in the sense of broadening the institution to encompass life and lives, but also in quite a subversive, quite a negative, perhaps subversive way, in which institutions are tending to swallow people up and set agendas for people in quite fine-grained ways.
I think we're also really aware that there have been shifts for generational shifts in the lifestyles and identities available to scientists. So the book begins with the introduction around lifestyle science is staged around three personas. James Watson, who's now in his 90s and for a very long time was director of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory on Long Island, and Craig Venter, who decoded the human genome and is in California with his own institute, the JCVI, and Nina Tandon, who is she's a co-director of Epibone, an entrepreneurial startup, and for some time she was based at Harlem Biospace. And we looked at those three figures in terms of their leisure preferences, the way they were presented, and the way they presented themselves, and the relationship that had to their organisation and its architecture. So for James Watson, he plays tennis, he drives a dark green Rolls Royce around campus, and he lives in a house on the campus features a neo-Georgian reproduction, as is much of the campus. So, and the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory depends a lot on the patronage of its neighbours, who also play tennis and drive dark green Rolls Royces around the place. So it was very much around that laboratory's assimilation with its neighbourhood and its appeal to that neighbourhood who run the Long Island Biological Association, which is the board. Yeah. And then Craig Venter, he's a yachter, boater. He drives motorbikes, he collects cars. In his office, he has several vintage motorbikes in his office space, and he presents himself as a kind of maverick scientist, someone who's an ex-surfer and is now, making risky but, world-saving decisions. Nina Tandon, on the other hand, is much younger than those two, and is trying to negotiate her way through scientists without the kind of financial backing or the stability of institutions that both Venter and Watson benefited from. So she started Epibone with a colleague pretty much out of postgraduate work, and they got some funding from Peter Thiel's startup breakout funds, and they were in Harlem Biospace, and Harlem Biospace is a very tiny, it's like a co-working laboratory. It's like WeWork for scientists. And so it's rented space on a precarious 6-month contract, and she does yoga, she collects street art, she's a vegetarian. So all her kind of the identity things seem kind of predictable, the way they each conceived of themselves. So we looked at those three figures in terms of their self-presentation, the architecture of where they were located, and the identities that were available to them. So it's a kind of a two-way relationship in that, yes, there's a lot of manipulation. There's also a kind of shaping of the self towards available identities. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's sort of it's actually quite a similar pattern, because they're adopting this nomenclature, this lifestyle that they see other scientists have, and so no matter what level you're at, you're still taking that on.
Yes.
It's very fascinating.
Yeah.
I wanted to also just point out, if anybody in the audience has questions or comments, please go ahead and add them into here, because I can see those and I'll relay them over to the panelists. So go ahead and do that. That's an interesting way that you're also putting it into this persona. So I'm gonna move on to another question, and unless we have somebody from the audience that wants to chime in. So you write, speculative laboratory buildings are a barometer for the financial health of the science research ecosystem. Are there any trends to note in this area since the publication?
Yeah, sure. So one of the areas that we were really interested in was bio real estate. And this is the investment section of the conversation. So those who are thinking of investing, here you go. I'm going to give you some advice. So there are two very big bio real estate corporations that are centered in the US, but they have buildings all around the world. Alexandra Real Estates and Bio Realty. And these are huge. So Biomed Realty Trust was founded in 2004. It has a market capitalization of $6 billion, has 84 properties. Alexandra Real Estate was founded a bit earlier. It's the largest. Its capitalization is $7 billion. It's got over 200 properties. These two companies, the properties they own have 97% occupancy rate, which is just extraordinary for leased buildings. And when Alexandria went public in 1997, in that period since then, it has outpaced Walmart in terms of the revenue generated for its stockholders. So on the one hand, you've got scientists who are coming up with ideas and setting up startups and innovation companies, and there's been a lot of conversation around investing in science, and so there's angel investors and all this kind of conversation, but the real money is in real estate. Because your startup company doesn't have the money to set up its own, own buildings. It needs to rent real estate. They're good, they're good tenants. They stay for a long time if they do well. If they do well, they want to expand. And so in this market, there was that recognition in the 90s that this was going to be big, and that this was actually bigger and a much more rewarding financially, a much more financially rewarding pursuit than putting your money into backing Epibone, for example.
Yeah, I think what we also noticed, I mean, the reason we can talk about it as a barometer is to do with the just the sense that so much money has been thrown into the biosciences over the last sort of couple of decades. The philanthropic money, government money, institutional money, university money has all been thrown in, and the buildings have tended to where they express that that mass input of money, and part of the expression of the part of the economic expression has been like a mass diversification in actually what we're seeing as bioscience laboratories. They're not, we think of them not really like, like butcher's shops. You can tend to recognize a butcher's shop as a butcher's shop when you drive past it. And even when it's no longer a butcher's shop and someone's turned it into their house still looks a little bit like a butchery. And but bioscience laboratories tend to have taken a mass different expressions. And I think this is large. So much money is being thrown in, and there's sort of a scramble to actually try and establish images for the laboratories themselves. I mean, some of the laboratories that were sort of visited over time, laboratories like this one here, this is the Centre for the Unknown in Lisbon, and its expression is really a very well-funded building, you know, and its expression is sort of based on this idea that we don't know what the future of the biosciences will be. We don't know where all this is sort of going. You know, and then we'll just heap loads of money on some very important pieces of real estate around the world, you know, and you know, and to establish sort of architecture in those spaces. I don't know if I'm sharing anymore, but am I sharing?
Now you are.
Now I am. So this is the PRBB in Barcelona. It's sort of in so many ways, it's the perfect image of a lifestyle science laboratory, you know, prime real estate on the beach of Barcelona. It projects something like of an image of, it could be a resort hotel in a way, and it opens itself up to the beach in this sort of direction. They, you know, has a timber screen that sort of wraps around it, and for all intensive purposes, it looks to be an entirely open and fluid sort of organization. Strangely enough, you know, what we tend to notice in all of these laboratories at the same time is that whilst they project a certain image, there's always a lot of very sort of silent and subtle control mechanisms, the sort of silent orders of the architecture or the organization, which relate to things like the contracts that scientists are signing and the protocols that are involved, but also the architectural controls as to who can enter what areas, and the tight sort of control and framing of laboratory spaces and negotiation of who's in and who's out of each particular lab. So what we get in this sort of lifestyle science is a sort of overlap of, well, not overlap's the wrong word. It's more like a very smooth translation between architecture and what is corporate, corporate investment.
Yeah. So those two examples, the first one, the Charles Career Design building, was funded through a bequest from a concrete billionaire.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Bequest, a quite vague bequest, and the other one the one in Barcelona has government funding. But returning to the bio realty, those buildings in the 90s, early 2000s were really dull. They were just big boxes, you know, mirrored glass. And now, of course, they're following the private and state institutions in being far more lavish, much better locations, also having the lifestyle facilities. So I might just show you one as well, and I can't remember, here we go, share, so that you can see that it's not just these private buildings. Oopsie. Now I've forgotten where, here we go.
Click the green button.
The green button, that's right. This is one of Biomed Realties in California, and you know, it's no longer the dull thing. It's sort of sure it's not as good as the Charles Career, but there's so much investment here in presenting a kind of lifestyle image, from the car to the landscaping.
Yeah, to the man with the cloak over his over his shoulders.
And then this is Alexandria's. So the other company, sorry, these are just screenshots because they weren't available, but you know, again, the whole sort of thing of the cars, the people, this whole lifestyle stuff. And the Biomed Realty one has it has a bocce court and a supermarket, all this kind of stuff, which is around lifestyle. So what were, you know, just about making profit, they're now having to also invest in images. They're also starting to really diversify. So instead of just making big boxes and multi-tenancy, they're doing also kind of little hipster ones for lettable real estate, which I find super interesting. We're also seeing new companies like insurance firms, health companies starting to invest in laboratory real estate because they're making, they're seeing an opportunity to make money out of it.
It's really interesting. I do want to bring in a question from the audience. This is from Kuyash. Kuyash asks, if we think about great scientists of the past, an image of an aesthetic person dedicated to his or her idea, deprived of worldly pleasures arises. Questions: how effective are new lifestyles centered labs in generation meaningful science? Do they serve people who push science? Kuyash, you're trying to ask if by putting this generation of scientists in the labs, are they really, who are they really serving? Are they serving just the scientists themselves, or are they serving the actual science? I think that's a very relevant question, because now that I think about it, like, if I was giving to science, I would like to see the science, for example. But if I gave $1 and I knew that 70 cents of that dollar went to one of these fancy buildings, how much of it went to the actual science? I don't know. What does that even mean, really?
It's probably not 70 cents in the dollar. This question has been a huge one for us over our work for quite some time, and it really relates to the, well, we keep being asked by people whenever we've had the book reviewed. So when the Times Higher Education in the UK reviewed it, and when Nature reviewed it, the key question sort of became something like, do these buildings produce better science? And the question's one we can't answer so simply. The sort of just the question of actually what good science might be becomes a very difficult thing, and the economics of the situation, the current situation for science is so radically different to how it was. It's everything is done at almost a national scale. So there's national investments in science and institutional scales, and the idea of the scientist, just the person beavering away to on their own, producing brilliant, having a brilliant idea one day, is just not the image that's currently at stake or in play.
Yeah, they just don't have the security of tenure. So the idea of, being an Einstein and being supported by your university, and it just doesn't happen. All the funding is project-based. So for someone like Nina Tandon and Epibone, she's dead serious about what she's doing. She's a good scientist. She's got a really interesting project. But to get funding, and she needs a lot of funding because she's got to do first animal testing, then human testing, she has to get the funding. And that means appealing to a range of people and convincing them to invest in her and her team. And that means that she needs a whole lot of skills that Einstein or others did not need to have. She has to have a whole lot of media skills, communication skills. She has to be able to explain the scientists to people who aren't trained in science. So she's got to actually, she went and did an MBA in entrepreneurship to be able to fuel her science. So she knows that she needed a whole lot of other skills.
And so much of the architecture actually is part of that
persuasion.
That power of persuasion. It is the media, it is the communication. It's also often the education. It sort of forms a sort of public education front for these organisations in a way. So it's very hard to disconnect the flow of the economic flows from the scientific production at this point in time. And the more we looked into it, the more confused we actually got. I think there was so much that when we try to follow the flows of money, the sort of figures that are involved are absolutely incredible, and the long-term investments. But they're long-term investments largely not sort of problem, but framed quite directly around economic response. That what will be the economic output. So when big pharma, is making big pharma investments, they're they're centered on actually what can be produced out of that. And the architecture becomes part of just that persuasion, communication sort of mechanism.
Yeah, yeah.
That's interesting. Well, we're coming up on time, but I wanted to either open it up to the audience for more questions, or if either of you want something to close on within this. I mean, this is actually, we could actually talk about this quite a bit longer, but I know that we allotted a certain time frame for this. But do you have anything else that you want to wrap up with?
Probably that the book has chapters with different views than we've presented today. That there's a lot of really interesting material in there. One of my favourite chapters is a discussion on the beanbag and the beanbag chair and its mobilisation in science and IT as a kind of symbol of innovation. I think it was such a really fantastic essay looking at the way an artefact can be brought into a space to symbolise a way of working, or a kind of democratization of the workspace and the kind of edginess of the workspace. And it seems like such a trivial item, but actually shifted the way people worked or were seen to be working enormously in the research space. So I think there are a lot of everyday things that we overlook that are actually having a huge impact on people's work lives in science.
Yeah. I think the book goes a long way to actually making it starting to deal with the complexity of the picture that's involved, and the complexity of the production of science, the production of scientists, and the production and the relationship of those things with the production of architecture at this point.
Mm.
Okay. We have one quick comment from Brian Lonsway. Thanks for the fabulous book and great talk and the excitement about the beanbag.
He's the author of the beanbag essay.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Brian, for joining us. Great. I love that piece. Oh, we got one other question here from Kulyash. This is just a good question. What about the lab's interior? As a practicing scientist, labs are not quite comfortable places. They're noisy bumps, bright lights, cold temperature, etc. What advances in ergonomics of scientists' work are those in new places, and do architects think about that?
Yeah, okay. So what's really super interesting about the design of the laboratory buildings is they're often designed by two different architectural practices. So on the one hand, you'll have the big name architect who's doing the exterior and the forms, and then you have laboratory planners who don't have the big name. The laboratory planners are designing the interiors. So this is why you often get a real disconnect in the interior design. I mean, the disconnect is there because one's around containment and hygiene and spotlessness. We're talking about the wet lab spaces, but those tend to be done by specialists. And then from that glazed wall that separates the laboratory from the rest of the building, it becomes the big name architect's responsibility. So they're very schizophrenic buildings. And, Chris mentioned the diversity. So, I always think they're a little bit like, battery operated gadgets. Like everyone's got a battery that's the same, but then the gadgets might be anything from a radio to a hairdryer to, whatever. The laboratories themselves are very homogenous. They all look the same, and a scientist can come in and work in that lab, go to another lab and feel, they know what's happening, but what's around them, the theatre around them, is what's changed so much.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just thank you both very much. This is an amazing book, and I think everybody should get into this. This is something that we all are part of and actually involved in as people who are part of the artistic research community. Ksenia says, thank you so much. Fascinating talk. Looking forward to reading the book. By the way, if you do want to get a copy of the book yourself, it's on the MIT Press website. We can offer you a discount code LEONARDO20 to get a 20% discount on that book. And please do subscribe to the Leonardo Book Club series for more talks like this. Next month, we'll be sharing the new Leonardo journal that is coming out this week, and then, or actually next week. And then we also have our monthly newsletter, which we put out quite a bit of our publications, open calls, our laser gatherings, and other things from our partners, and things like this that happen all over the world. So thank you very much, and appreciate both of you all for doing this. And we will be archiving this on Facebook and YouTube, and we encourage you to share this with your friends and colleagues as we continue this dialogue online. This, we hoping, is a living conversation, that this particular recording is not just the end of it, but we can continue this conversation. Hopefully Sandra and Chris will contribute to any other questions that you have once we have that up online. So thank you all very much, and have a fantastic rest of your evening or morning or day, wherever in the world that you are in.
Thank you.
Thank you.